Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Elevate Your Photoshop Work Show with Smart Objects, presented by Sean Bagshaw. I am Trevor Pogson of the RPS Digital Imaging Committee. I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to all 290 of you. We're glad to see so many of you taking the time to be with us today. In addition to members of digital imaging, we have many Royal Photographic Society members and non-members from all over the world. Before we get started, I would like to go over a few housekeeping items so that you'll know how to take part in today's event. For today's event, we have turned on closed captioning for the benefit of the people who need it. You can switch it on or off using the live transcript icon at the bottom of your screen, unless you're using a tablet. If you are using a tablet and want to turn closed captions on or off, please send us a message using the Q&A icon and we'll send you the instructions. This Zoom event has a special question and answer feature. At the bottom of your screen, or possibly the top if you're using a tablet, you will see a Q&A icon. You can click on this to ask a question at any time during the presentation. Now, at the end of Sean's presentation, there will be time for him to answer your questions. His presentation is going to be so good that you will immediately want to thank him for it, but please don't. There will be an opportunity for your feedback after the event. So please, for today, questions only. Sean will answer as many of your questions as time permits. It is with great pleasure that I introduce Sean Bagshaw. Sean is a landscape and travel photographer, photography educator and experience junkie based in Ashland, Oregon, USA. His full-time photography career started in 2004, and before that, he was a middle school science teacher. He began taking photos in college to record and share his adventures on rock climbs and mountaineering expeditions. Over time, his photography evolved from being documentary to creative. Now he spends a lot of his time chasing the light, sleeping in a van, eating bad food and avoiding showers. So as we hand over to Sean, I just want to remind you to use the Q&A feature to ask any questions, which will be answered after the presentation. So Sean, over to you.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be here. Hello to everyone out there. It's an honor to be here for my second time presenting for the Royal Photographic Society. And today we've got some cool stuff that I want to share with all of you. So we're going to jump right in. The first thing I'm going to do is just get some housekeeping stuff out of the way. So I'm going to quickly share my screen, make sure that I get my correct screen shared here. So this is my website. There's going to be an end screen later that has the URL to my website, but in case anybody is going there, this is what it looks like. And the content that I'm going to be presenting on today on smart objects is actually in a course that I've created, and that's found in this tab right here, tutorials and TK Photoshop plugins. And if you go to that tab and scroll down, it's the first course here, and it says smart objects right on it. So everything I'm going to cover today is in that course, plus much, much more. And I have lots of other video courses in all kinds of image developing things as well. And also the TK8 plugin for Photoshop is available on my website. So I just wanted to get that out of the way. Oh, and also there is going to be a discount code available to everyone who's here watching the presentation. That'll be up on the end screen. I think that'll come out in an email as well. It's RPS 20. And originally it was for a 20% discount. I realize we have Black Friday coming up, and there's going to be, and that's just a couple of weeks, we've got a 25% discount coming with that. So the RPS 20 discount will actually give you 25%. I figured why not just extend that, since that's what it's going to be in a couple of weeks anyway. Okay, that's out of the way. Let's learn about smart objects. Now, normally I might wax philosophic about creativity versus tools and techniques in photography, but today our time is really limited. So I'm going to just focus on the techniques part, and I'm going to allow you to figure out how and if any of this fits into your artistic and creative vision. And before I begin, I'm also going to say, let me address the fact that I'm sure there's a lot of questions out there because Adobe just recently released an update to Lightroom and Camera Raw with new masking features. And so I've already been getting a lot of questions about, like, how does this affect Photoshop. Is Photoshop still necessary? These new masks in Lightroom, what do we think about that? Now, there's not time for me today to compare the relative advantages of Lightroom versus Photoshop. I'm just going to be focusing on the smart object techniques. But I will say that the new masks in Lightroom are an amazing update. They're really powerful. They're a great improvement. But for the work that I do, Photoshop still provides more options and flexibility and fine control for those of us who want or need that. And I think also, as you'll see through this presentation, that if you're using smart objects in Photoshop, then these new masks in Lightroom not only improve Lightroom, but they also improve Photoshop. So that's all that I'll say about that for now. There may be some questions that come up later, but we're going to focus on Photoshop. So in this session, I'm going to be briefly explaining what smart objects are, number one, and number two, show some ideas for ways that smart objects can be used when developing images in Photoshop. I know that not everyone uses Photoshop and not everyone even uses Adobe products at all, but this is a specific feature of Photoshop. So this will be, I think, particularly useful for Photoshop users. And if you're not a Photoshop user, I think it'll give you some good ideas about some of the things that you can do in Photoshop that maybe you can't do in other applications. We're going to cover a lot of information in a short period of time. This presentation, I think, is going to be available for replay. And like I said, my Smart Object course will extend the stuff that I'm doing in this presentation considerably. So Lightroom and also Camera Raw, Lightroom and Camera Raw, actually the develop module in Lightroom and Camera Raw are really the same thing. They have all the same tools and functions and features. So in this presentation, I'll just be saying Lightroom, but just know that if you use Camera Raw instead of Lightroom, they're really interchangeable. And so I'm referring to the same thing. So Lightroom and Photoshop adjust images differently, and both have advantages and disadvantages. Lightroom is always non-destructive. And what I mean by non-destructive is not that, you know, if something's non-destructive, it isn't destroying your images. You can non-destructively destroy your images just fine. What I mean by non-destructive is that there's nothing that you're doing that you can't undo or adjust at any point in the future, and there's no correct order to do things in. So in Lightroom, you can do things in any order, and anything that you do, you can always undo later. That's non-destructive. So Lightroom is always non-destructive. But there are some limitations with Lightroom in the types of adjustments that are available and the types of things you can or can't do when working on images. Now, Photoshop has more adjustment options and it can be more precise. And one of the great things about Photoshop is you can work with multiple frames because Photoshop supports layers. So those are the advantages of Photoshop, but in Photoshop, it is possible to do things that are destructive. And again, I don't mean destroying your photo. I mean destroying your workflow, in that you can do things in the wrong order to kind of work yourself into a corner, or do things that you can't undo in the future if you want to. So it's kind of a toss-up, you know, Lightroom, Photoshop. And the reality is that I use them both interchangeably. I use Lightroom and I use Photoshop. And one of the great things about smart objects is it allows me to get the benefits of both. So I get all the Lightroom advantages while working in Photoshop. So smart objects do two main things for photographers. They do a lot of things, but for photographers, these are the two main things. Number one, they provide additional ways to work creatively and non-destructively in Photoshop. So smart objects can help you not box yourself into a corner you can't get out of in Photoshop. And number two, like I already mentioned, that smart objects allow us to use Lightroom tools and work with the original raw image data in Photoshop, from Photoshop. So those two things are really big advantages. The way that I think about smart objects is like a container. And let me get Photoshop up here so we can actually see what I'm talking about. And I'll assume that if we're ever not seeing the right thing, that someone will let me know that, of course. Otherwise, I'll just press on ahead. Okay, so in Photoshop, the way that I think about smart objects is that they're like containers. The container looks like an image on the outside, but it can also contain additional contents or information on the inside. So in Photoshop, this image is not a smart object. If I look at this layer, that's the image layer, I can see the thumbnail is the pixels of the image, and that's all it is. It's just the pixels. And there's a lot to those pixels and a lot of information in those pixels, but the container is the outside, the pixels is what you see is what you get. If it's a smart object, there's more to it than just that. So how does an image or a layer become a smart object? Well, in Photoshop, if you have a pixel layer that's not a smart object, you can convert it to a smart object. And that's done lots of ways. Everything in Photoshop can usually be done 4 or 5 different ways, but an easy way to do it is to just right click on the kind of the gray bar here of that layer. And one of the options in that contextual menu that pops up is convert to smart object. So if you just click that, what you'll notice is that this little icon now appears in the lower right-hand corner of the thumbnail, and that indicates that this is a smart object. So without that icon, it's a regular pixel layer. With that icon, it's a smart object. I was going to point out that over here, this is the TK panel. Some of you may be familiar with that. It's a plugin for Photoshop that I use. There's lots of different plugins out there. This is the one I use. Normally, everything I'm going to be doing in this presentation, I'd be using the panel, but I know that not everyone is a TK panel user, so I'm not going to be using it for this presentation, but that's what this is. And there's another module to it up here. Lots of information about that on my website if anybody's interested. Okay, so we have a smart object and it's a container, and inside the container are contents. And the way that you get to the contents of the container is by double clicking on it. So if I go back to this backed up one in the history, it's not a smart object. If I double click on that, it says, do you want to make a new layer? That's what Photoshop is going to give us. You want to make a new layer because you can't do anything with that one layer as it is. But if we go back to the smart object, so now it's a smart object. I just moved ahead in the history. If I double click on that, watch what happens. What it did was it opened the contents. So here's the original image with the smart object. And when I opened up that smart object, the contents of it is over here. It opened it up in its own tab. The contents right now is just the image because I haven't done anything. So the contents of this smart object is just the image. And when I'm done with the contents, I could do anything I want to the contents in here. I could add adjustment layers. I could do cloning or patching or healing or whatever you might do in Photoshop to adjust it. And then I would save the contents just with a regular control or command save, or up here in the file menu, just a regular save. And I can't do it now because I haven't done anything to change it yet. Just a regular save. And then you close the contents, and that takes you back to the container of the smart object. Okay, so smart objects are like a container. They have an outside to the container, and then they have stuff inside the container. That's the basic idea of it. And because smart objects can contain stuff, that makes them have all kinds of abilities that a regular pixel layer doesn't have. So what kinds of things? Oh, and before we go on, I'll just mention that there are 2 types of smart objects that we're going to talk about today. One is called a converted smart object. That's what this one is. I had a regular pixel layer and I converted it to a smart object. The other type of smart object we're going to talk about is a raw smart object. Raw smart objects are opened as smart objects from Lightroom. They start as smart objects. They came from Lightroom that way. We'll get to those later. But for now, this is a converted smart object because I made it a smart object, converted it to a smart object here in Photoshop. So what are some of the things that smart objects allow us to do? Let me back up again. I'm going to go back in the history here. Not a smart object. One of the things in Photoshop that we can do really well that Lightroom is less good at doing is transforming images or modifying the perspective of the image or the shape of the image. And one of those things is free transform. So I'm going to come up here to edit. Let's see. Oh, I have to unlock the background. This is the background layer. It's got the little lock box on it. So to be able to transform a background layer, you just have to click on that and unlock it. Now I can come to edit, free transform, or it's Control or Command T is the keyboard shortcut to get there. And now I've got these handles, and that allows me to change the size of the image. I can rotate it. I can even, compress it. I can do all kinds of things with it. And if it's not a smart object, watch what happens. If I shrink this way down and committed to that, so now I made this a little tiny image down there. And depending on what you're doing, for example, if you're working with multiple image layers together in one image, you might be sizing one of those images to fit better with the other image, or all kinds of things you might be doing where you would size or transform an image like that. But now I realize, oh, I kind of overdid it. I went too small. I actually want it to be big again. So I'm just going to do a Control or Command T to transform again. And now when I bring that back out, let's say I want to get it back full size again and commit to that. Look at what's happened to the quality of that image, because when I sized it down, when it wasn't a smart object, I threw away a whole bunch of pixels. And now when I try to make it big again, I've got this highly pixelated image. So let's get out of there back to the original state. If I instead make this a smart object first, so I've converted to a smart object. Now, because that smart object can contain information in its contents, when I do a transformation to this, so same transformation, shrink it way down and commit to that transformation. Now it's really small. Realize, oh, I didn't want to shrink it that much. So I'm going to transform again, Control or Command T, make it big again. Notice that my quality is still there. So what was stored in the contents of that smart object was all the information about all the pixels in the image. We didn't throw any pixels away. So one of the things we get with smart objects is what are called smart transformations. So instead of just transforming the image, it's a smart transformation, meaning that we can undo it, we can back it up at any time, and we're not losing any image quality. And in that way, it helps you keep your workflow in Photoshop non-destructive. And it's not just for transformations. We can also do, whoops, let me back up again to before this was a smart object. Where were we here? Okay, so instead of a transformation, so I'm in free transform here, this button up here in the free transform space is warp mode. So if I click that, we're now in warp mode. And instead of just changing the size or the aspect ratio of the image, we can now warp the image. We can actually bend it. So depending on, if you have lens distortion or different types of distortion in the image that you want to remove, warp is one thing that you can do to help remove that. Again, this is something that Lightroom is not good at, this kind of stuff. So without a smart object, if I were to commit to that and then realize, oh yeah, now I want to go back to warp because I overwarped it, I can't unwarp it now. It's been permanently warped. I mean, I can continue warping it more, but I'll never get it back to how it was. So let's escape out of there and let's go back and make this a smart object and find out that in addition to smart transformations, we also get smart warp. So if I warp it like that and commit to the warp and then realize, okay, nope, I don't want to do that, come back to warp mode. And because it's a smart object, I can unwarp it. I can reverse that warp. In fact, I can completely reset the warp back to its original and get right back to where I was. So smart transformations and smart warps are two of the things that smart objects give us in Photoshop. Okay, but we're just getting started here. Whoops, let's go back here. What other kinds of things? Well, Photoshop has things called filters. This is the filter menu, all kinds of filters here. Again, this is something that Photoshop's good at, that it has accessible to us, that Lightroom does not. So what if we want to do some sort of, let me back up again so that this is not a smart object, so we can see what that looks like. If I want to apply a filter, let's see, I'm going to go to the blur gallery here in the filters and apply a path blur to this image. And here's my path blur workspace. And I'm going to blur this image to kind of create this, this vertical blur. I'm going to increase how much blur there is. And at some point I'm going to say, okay, that looks great. I like that blur that I added to the trees. And so now I've applied that filter, but because it wasn't a smart object, this blur has been applied directly to the pixels of the image. And now if I were to save this and come back later, I can't get my unblurred pixels back. This is a destructive move because I can't undo it later. And in fact, if I wanted to say, you know what, I realize I just want the blur on the upper part of the image, not down here, I don't have any way to unblur part of the image. So let's back up to trying the same thing again, instead of with a pixel layer, with a smart object. So same thing as I did before, except for now it's a smart object. I'm going to go to Filter, Blur Gallery, Path Blur, and I'm going to create that same blur that I did before and blur it out a lot and say, okay. And now what you'll notice is that below the pixel layer, below the container of the smart object, I have this sublayer, and it's called a smart filter. So smart objects turn Photoshop filters into smart filters. And the great thing about smart filters is if you didn't get the filter right the first time, right here where it says blur gallery, I can just double click that and I'm back into my blur adjustments, and I can modify them now and get them fine-tuned the way I want them. So that's cool. And the other thing that's cool is I can, so it's now non-destructive. I can undo or modify at any point in the future. And also smart filters come with smart filter masks. And that means that if I want this filter to only apply to part of the image, I can go on the mask and I could mask in any way that you normally mask in Photoshop. I'm just going to use a gradient to make a gradient filter here. And what I'm doing is with a gradient, I'm masking out the filter in the bottom part of the image here. So now I've got my blur applied only to the top part of the image and not the bottom part of the image the way I wanted it. And I can also turn the filter on and off to see what it looks like with the filter and without the filter. So another great advantage of smart objects in Photoshop is that they turn filters into smart filters. And the other cool thing about smart filters is they don't have to just be Photoshop filters. So for example, if you use any third-party plugins with Photoshop, so for example, any of the Topaz applications, or like Nik, the DxO Nik suite, you can apply those. If it's a smart object, you can go to filter. I'm going to come, sorry, where are my, oh, here they are, sorry. So here's my Nik collection. Here's my Topaz collection. Let's just go to Nik and we'll go into Color Effects Pro 4. That's going to open up here. And I think you should be able to see that. So here we are in Color Effects Pro 4, and I've got a brilliance and warmth filter. I'm just going to really maximize it so it's really obvious. I'm overdoing that and say, okay. And now what we'll find is that this filter, that Nik filter, is applied, and look, it's right here. It's a smart filter too. So if I realize that I don't like how that looks, I can double click on that. It'll take me back into Nik, and I can future adjust my Nik filter as well. So smart filters, even third-party filters, become smart filters that way. So really great stuff with smart objects. Okay, what kinds of other things? Let's see. Oh, here's another filter that I want to show. Whoops, and we've got all kinds of layers here. I forgot this has layers in it. So I'm going to show a couple of things with this image. Number one is that I want to apply a filter to this image that's called the liquefy filter. It's a Photoshop filter, but it has to be applied to a pixel layer. So I could apply the liquefy filter to the background layer. It has pixels, but above that, I've got all these other layers, dodge and burn layers, and I've got layers with luminosity masks and different things like that. And if I change the pixels of the background layer, the liquefy filter won't also change the masks and the dodge and burn layers the same. There's no way to do that in Photoshop without smart objects. So my image no longer matches my mask, and then we have problems with how the image looks. So a couple things we can do here. I can select all of these, every layer, and we might normally think, okay, well, the only way out of this is to merge all of those layers together into one pixel layer, or just flatten them, you know. So if you have a flattened layer that you're going to liquefy, then it doesn't matter. Those masks are now all gone. They're cooked into the pixels of the image. So now you can do your liquefy and not worry about the mask getting out of alignment. But now that's a destructive move in your workflow, because later, if you need to adjust those masks or those layers, you can't undo that and get back to it. So instead of flattening or merging these layers, what if we converted them? So right click, convert to smart objects. I'm just going to put all of those layers into a smart object. So here's the container. It's got the little smart object icon. So it's a smart object. And if I double click it, the contents open up over here, new tab up here. The contents open up. So all my layers and everything are still in there. Awesome. Now I could work with those layers and then save this, and it'll update that back to the container. I'm not going to do that right now. I'm just going to go ahead and close that. We're back to the container here. The container is just a picture of what's inside. So all those layers that are inside there determine what the image looks like out here on the outside of the container. But I wanted to liquefy this. So I'm going to come up to Filter, Liquefy. And this filter is really cool because you can do different things. You can do all kinds of crazy liquefy moves. I didn't want to do that one, so undo that. What I want to do is actually, I want to grow the mountain a little bit. So I'm going to use this tool right here, which is the expand tool. And I'm just going to hover over the mountain, and you can see I can grow this mountain. If I want to make that a little bigger, have a little more weight in the composition, and then I can come to this tool right here, and this is the shrink feature. I can drop these mountains into the distance and make them look a little further away. So there. So if I say okay to that, I've now made that transformation as a smart filter. So I can undo it, and I can even go into the smart filter, the liquefy filter, and undo. I can, completely get rid of it, or I can just go in and modify it. And if I want to adjust any of the layers and masks in the smart object, I can still just double click the smart object, and that opens up a new tab with all the contents in there. And I can come in and let's say I just make really quick here. Let's see, what would be an obvious adjustment that I can make? Actually, I'm just going to add a whole new adjustment layer here. And I'm going to do a hue saturation really over the top, just because it'll be obvious. So that's this new adjustment that I made in the contents. And now I'm going to do a Control or Command S, just a normal save, to save this. Now, saving smart objects takes a while. And that's one of the downsides of smart objects, is because saving all of that additional information makes larger file sizes, and the saves and things like that can take a little longer. So anyway, but now that that's saved, I can close the contents again and watch what happens when we go back to the outside of the container. Here it is. So that adjustment that I made to the contents now shows up on the container, but notice it matches and it works with the liquefy filter that I did. That's a smart filter. And if I turn that on and off, you can see it doesn't matter whether or not I'm doing the liquefy filter. The contents inside can be worked on also with smart filters from the outside. So more benefits there. That's a horrible adjustment. So if I realize, oh man, I really messed up my my saturation there, just double click, open up the contents. There's that hue saturation adjustment that I made. Just come back to that and say, well, that was way too much. Maybe more somewhere in there looks better. Resave it, Control or Command S, resave that smart object. Again, it takes a little longer to save than if it wasn't a smart object, but in terms of being able to get back and rework with some of this stuff and not create a destructive workflow, it's worth it for me for the extra file size. So now when I close this and come back to the contents, now I've got my image back how it was. So I guess the takeaway there is, anytime in Photoshop, if you feel like you're getting into a spot where your only hope is to flatten your layers because of the next thing you want to do, instead of flattening, think about merging them together into a single smart object. It gives you the same functionality as flattening, but you also don't create a destructive workflow. All right, let's see. So lots of other things there. I want to make sure, let's see, I'm going to show one more thing that we can do with smart objects. And then we're going to move on to raw smart objects for the second half here. So a lot of the things that we do in Photoshop involve multiple layers, adjustment layers, blurs, filters, all kinds of things. And one of the powerful things of Photoshop is the way it works with layers and masks allows us to kind of stack together a lot of different things that each one might be a small adjustment, and incrementally over all of these adjustments, it adds up to something. And there are certain techniques that we use, but a lot of them get, again, complicated by the fact that certain things you do in Photoshop, you can't undo later. So again, some of those techniques, using smart objects with these techniques, really is helpful. And one example is a technique that gets used a lot. Here in the States, we call it the Orton effect, after Michael, I believe it's Michael Orton, who originated this idea in film photography, which creates kind of a painterly soft glow to images. And like I said, it's originally an analog film technique, but there are lots of ways that you can create an Orton effect, or probably a more accurate term for it would be a kind of a soft light glow. Lots of ways to do it in Photoshop. Here's one way that I like to do it, but I'm going to show how a smart object can be really helpful with it. So the first thing I need to do is duplicate my background. So I'm going to do that. So just Control or Command J. So now I've got to copy the background. So this background, these pixels are going to stay as they are. And this layer, I'm going to modify those pixels. And then I'm going to kind of combine the two together. Again, this is stuff you can't do in Lightroom. Now, this pixel layer, if I can do all this stuff to this pixel layer, but if it's not a smart object, the things I'm going to do to those pixels can't be undone later. So I want to be able to adjust them later. So I'm going to first start off by converting it to a smart object. So now it's a smart object. We can see there's the little icon. And the things that I'm going to do to this are, I'm first going to blur those pixels. So I'm going to come up here to Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur. And I don't want to blur the pixels 750 pixels. That's way too much. Probably something closer to about 15 pixels, just a slight blur, and say okay to that. And there's my blur smart filter. So I can go back to that. If I didn't get the blur right, I'm not stuck with it. I can go back. One advantage. And the other thing I need to do here is I need to apply a levels contrast adjustment. Now, it needs to be applied directly to the pixels for this to work. I could do a levels adjustment layer, but that's not going to directly affect the pixels in this layer. So I actually want to apply this not as a separate adjustment layer. I want to make the levels adjustment directly to this layer. So instead, what I need to do is come up to Image, Adjustments, and go to Levels here. So this is not an adjustment layer. This is an actual pixel level adjustment that I'm going to make. So I'm going to adjust these pixels, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring the contrast, really boost that contrast way up. So bring up the highlights, bring down the shadows, the darks, really create a lot of contrast in there, and say okay. And if we look, now my levels adjustment is here under smart filters. So another benefit is not only are filters smart filters, but adjustments to pixel layers become smart adjustments. which means I can reopen my levels adjustment and undo that if I need to in the future. Now that I've done that, the other thing I want to do is bring the opacity of this layer way down, probably to around maybe 15, 20%, somewhere in there. And now we can see there's that kind of nice soft light glow that's adding to my soft light forest image. And that adjustment, because I did it with a smart object layer, I can fine tune it at any point in the future. I can reopen my levels, I can reopen my blur and further adjust that as needed. Okay, so that's kind of an example of how smart objects might work into something we would normally do in Photoshop anyway, but it just allows us to make that thing non-destructive. Okay, so those are things all, how are we doing on time? Oh, perfect timing so far. Those are all things that we can do with converted smart objects. So everything I've done so far are with objects that we've converted from a regular pixel layer from inside of Photoshop. But now we're going to jump over to raw smart objects. So I'm going to stop. Actually, let me see. I want to first close all of these tabs because I think we don't need them for what's coming next. So I'm just going to go to close all and say, don't save any of them. Okay, they're all gone. And I'll stop sharing Photoshop. I'm going to share Lightroom real quick. Here's Lightroom, so you can see what I'm doing here. So let's go to this image here in Lightroom. Let's get it big. Okay, so this image is a raw file. It's a CR2 file. That's an old Canon raw file type from a few years ago when I took this image. So it's a raw file. And if I go to the develop module here in Lightroom, I might normally in my workflow say, okay, I'm going to start working on this in Lightroom. I'm going to make some raw adjustments. And then there's some other things that I know Photoshop's better for. So I'm going to move it over to Photoshop and then continue working in Photoshop. But I need to get my raw adjustments correct first here in Lightroom. So I'm going to, let's see, with this image, I'll say I'm going to bring up the exposure, bring down the highlights, might bring up the shadows a bit. Yeah, maybe work with the contrast a little. And then I'm going to work. Oh yeah, I think that's the right saturation for this image. So I'm going to go saturation. Oh, maybe vibrance too. Oh yeah, let's really get this looking good. And now I'm going to right click on that, come down to edit in, and let's edit this thing in Photoshop. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. Now that's opening up in Photoshop where you guys can't see it right now. But I'm going to stay here in Lightroom. And I opened it the first time as just a regular pixel layer. So sent that over to Photoshop as it's basically a TIFF file. So it's pixels, not raw data. I'm going to do this another time. I'm going to come down to edit in, but instead of edit in Photoshop, I'm going to come down here and say open as a smart object in Photoshop. Let's try that. Okay, so that's now being sent over to Photoshop as a smart object. So I'll stop sharing Lightroom and let's go back to Photoshop now. Okay, back in Photoshop. Here's this image and we've got it open twice. I've got two tabs here and notice they both look identical. So no matter which one I click on, they look the same, but this one does not have the smart object icon. So we can see that that is not a smart object. Those are actual pixels. And this one is a smart object because I opened it as a smart object. And this is different. This is not converted to a smart object here in Photoshop. I opened it as a smart object and there's a difference. In fact, if I come back to here and convert this to a smart object, now it's a smart object too. And notice they look the same. That little icon is identical. So you actually can't tell the difference by looking which one is which, but they are different. And in fact, again, this isn't a presentation about the TK panel, but one of the things that Tony built in, Tony Kuipers, who makes the panel, because Photoshop doesn't give us a way to tell the difference. If you notice here, this is the smart object button in this module here. And if it's a converted smart object, that button has a red outline around it. So we know that's a converted smart object. If I click to this one, it's a blue outline. That tells me this is a raw smart object. So that's a nice little indicator to help me know what kind of smart object am I dealing with and why is it important to know? Well, if I come to this smart object, which is a converted smart object, and double click on it to open up the contents is just the image. That's all. I can get to the image, which is what I'm already getting to here. But if I come to the raw smart object, the one that was opened as a smart object from the raw file in Lightroom, when I double click on that, what we get is it opens the image in Camera Raw. And that's the fundamental difference between a converted smart object and a raw smart object, is that raw smart objects link back to the original raw information. And when you open their contents, the contents is the raw data. So we're in Photoshop, where normally you can't work with raw data in Photoshop. You can only work with pixel data. But smart objects, if they're opened as raw smart objects from the original raw file, we now can work with raw data from inside Photoshop, and that's awesome. So if we look at this here, let me get up to the basic tab. What we'll notice is that this isn't just the raw Camera Raw filter on the pixels. This is the actual raw file. If we take a look here, CR2. So that's telling us we're going back to the original raw data. It's the raw file. And if we also look here, all of my adjustments that I made in Lightroom are here in Camera Raw. And remember, I said that Camera Raw and Lightroom, they look a little different, but the develop module in Lightroom is the same as Camera Raw. And all of those Lightroom adjustments are here. So if I realize, oh man, I really messed up the vibrance and the saturation, there they are. I can bring them down and get them to a more useful level. And that is happening at the raw data level. And all of those raw adjustments are available to me here, and not just the Lightroom adjustments in terms of the sliders, but any of the other adjustments like the different local adjustment tools in Lightroom. And this is where, Lightroom's and Camera Raw's new mask features come in, because if I click on this to get into those new features, so I can use, for example, the radial tool. If I wanted to put a radial adjustment here on the trees and kind of brighten those up a bit down here in the foreground, and I like using Lightroom's radial adjustment tool for that, I can do that. I could also use any of the other masking features that are new here and apply them to the raw file. And then when I say okay, that updates back in Photoshop. So now I've got a Lightroom radial filter that I have control over in Photoshop. And also all of my raw adjustments, like that horrible saturation adjustment that I got rid of in this file. If I tried to get rid of that horrible saturation, I can't. It's cooked into the pixels. So that is an amazing thing about raw smart objects, is in addition to all the other things that smart objects do. So all those things I already showed you about converted smart objects in terms of smart transformations and smart warps, about smart filters, about being able to contain layers and all that kind of stuff. Raw smart objects have all those same features, with the added benefit of also connecting back to Lightroom adjustments and raw information. So what kinds of things can we use that for? Additional things. So let's see. I did want to show one other thing. If you're not a Lightroom user, you might be thinking, well, how do I do this if I'm not a Lightroom user? If you just use Photoshop and Camera Raw only, if you come in to open a smart object, so let's see, I'm going to open a different raw smart object, this one here. Let's see what this one is. Don't even remember now. Hopefully it's nothing embarrassing. It's this one. Okay. So I'm opening this in Photoshop without Lightroom. So I'm coming not from Lightroom, I'm coming from Photoshop, and it's a raw file. So it goes to Camera Raw first. And if I just open it, and here's the adjustments that I've previously made in Lightroom, but they're here. If I just open it, it's not a smart object, but you've got this little menu that pops down. If I pop down that menu, one of the options is open as object. So if you're not a Lightroom user, you can still open your raw files as raw smart objects by using open as object instead of just regular open. All right, so I just want to make sure that's available to people. And let's see, what other kinds of things? Oh, well, so here's a cool thing is, I tried to pre-make my Lightroom adjustments before going to Photoshop. Well, you can still do that, but you no longer need to, because a lot of times we don't know what the adjustments in Lightroom need to be before Photoshop, because once we start doing things in Photoshop, that's when we can tell also what the Lightroom adjustments need to be. For example, maybe for white balance or other things that Lightroom's really good at. Adjusting the white balance is something that is much better to do at the raw level, easier to do. And but you don't know exactly what the white balance needs to be. Don't worry about the white balance in Lightroom. Open it in Photoshop, start working in Photoshop, and then you can fine tune the raw white balance as you go to best match what you're trying to accomplish. So a lot of times these days, I don't do any adjustments in Lightroom, or very few adjustments in Lightroom. I just go straight to Photoshop. And I really do think of Photoshop and Lightroom as kind of one and the same now. And from Photoshop, I can make my Lightroom adjustments, I can make my Photoshop adjustments, and I can go back and forth so that the adjustments I'm making in both really work together harmoniously. And also, I know it's non-destructive. I haven't committed to anything that I can't get out of later. All right, so let's look at some things here. Okay, so we've seen that this power to open up that smart object is really powerful and get to that raw data. But the real power from raw smart objects in Photoshop comes when we start combining layers and masks, because that's some of the stuff that Photoshop is really powerful with, is the ability to have multiple layers and use masks to combine different parts of different layers. And when you combine that with raw data, the sky really becomes the limit. So let's look at this. I've got this one smart object. I've got my blue here, so I know that's my raw smart object. If you don't have something that'll indicate to you what type of raw smart or what type of smart object it is, you just double click it. And if you double click and it opens up a new tab with the contents, you know it's a converted smart object. If you double click it and it opens up camera raw, you know it's a raw smart object. So this is a raw smart object. I'm going to go ahead and close this one just because I don't think we need that anymore. I don't want it to confuse things. So here, if I want to work with multiple iterations of my raw adjustments, I can. I can make copies of smart objects. And if we come here, let's see, I think we can, yeah. So when I right click on this smart object, we've got two options for making a copy of it. We've got this option, which is called duplicate layer. And if you duplicate the layer, you get what's called linked smart objects. So I'll do that. Ask me, what do I want to name it? I'm just going to give it that name. So now it's a copy of this one. And this one is linked to this one. Notice this indicator is now orange. That's telling us that this smart object is linked to this one. So it's still a raw smart object, but it's also a linked raw smart object. And what does that mean? Well, if I open up the contents of this one, the bottom one, doesn't matter if I open up the contents of either one, which is the raw information in camera raw, and I make an adjustment to that one. Let's just say I bring the exposure way down and say, okay, that adjustment happens to both smart objects because they're linked together. So whatever I do to this one happens to this one. Okay, so that's that type of smart object. Now let's do a different kind of copy. I'm going to right click, and instead of saying duplicate, so I'm going to make a third copy. So we'll have 3 layers here, but instead of saying duplicate layer, I'm going to do new smart object via copy. So duplicating makes them linked, copying them this way makes them unlinked. And notice now I've got the blue back. So this is telling me this is an unlinked smart object. So it's not linked to either of these two. And if I open this one, I get back to the same raw data, but that's one of the great things about raw data is it can be interpreted many different ways. So each of these layers is coming from the same raw data, but I'm interpreting different versions of the raw data. So I can take the exposure of this one back to where, let's see, something like this and say, okay. And now this one has the updated exposure setting and the other two below do not. And what does this do for us? This is amazing. Having unlinked versions of the same raw file means that now I can combine aspects of one conversion, raw conversion, with aspects of another raw conversion. So, and I can do that with masks in Photoshop. So for example, if I wanted to have one white balance for my sky and one bunch of settings for my sky, I could open up this one. Opening, there it is, and say, okay, what do I want my sky to look like? So I'm going to bring the exposure down a little bit, bring the highlights down somewhere in there, and I'm going to warm that sky up a little bit, a little more magenta, and I may bring up my saturation a little bit, bring a little more color into that sky, and let's see, maybe a little bit of dehaze to kind of create a little more drama and say, okay, there's my sky. Are we updating? There we go. So that's my sky. But at this point, that applies to the whole image. I want to have different set of raw adjustments for my landscape. So I need to apply a mask to this layer so I can see through to this layer for the landscape adjustments. And that's really easy to do. I can just come up to, I believe it's, it's select. And I can say, select the sky. And Photoshop will just select the sky for us. And that's one of the new things that they added into Lightroom too, is a sky selection like this. What you can't do in Lightroom is work with two separate layers like this. All right, so now that I have that sky selection that Photoshop made for me, I'm just going to create a mask on this layer, and that sky selection will become the mask. So there's my mask. And now that's making that adjustment go just to the sky. And now I can open up the Smart Object underneath that layer. And now I can say, this is the one that's going to be for the land. How do I want the land to look? Well, let's see, maybe the land's going to look like open up the shadows a little more. Might want to bring up the temperature a little bit, but I'm going to keep the land a little cooler than I had the sky in that other image. And I'm not going to bring the magenta into the landscape. And here, let's see, I may want to do a little more, maybe less contrast. I don't know. I don't want to saturate the land quite as much as I did the sky, maybe a little bit more. And maybe instead of dehaze, maybe in the land, I want to do a little clarity just to clarify those trees a little bit and say, okay to that. And now when that updates, this layer is the one that is controlling my land. So I can combine two different versions of my raw file together into one image. And that gives me amazing control. And it's not just two, I can make as many of these copies of that raw file for different parts of the image that I want and combine them all together. So really powerful there. How are we doing on time? Oh, we're almost getting on our hour. So I'm going to show one more example here. There's many more examples that I can show. So as we get into the Q&A a little bit later, if someone has a specific question of something I didn't show that you'd like to see an example of, I can always do that. But the last example I want to show here of what the kind of the power of raw smart objects is, a lot of times we're using Photoshop to combine elements of different exposures or frames that we took in the camera, because sometimes we'll shoot a scene. In fact, I'm going to stop sharing this real quick and go to Lightroom so you can see this. Here's an example. Oh, there's that guy in Lightroom again. Okay, let's see, which one do I want? Yeah, let's use this one. Okay, so here's a scene shooting straight into the sun. I exposed this for the land because I wanted to not lose shadow detail. I didn't want to clip my shadows down here in these deep shadows, which is great. I got all of that information. We can see in the histogram, my sky is completely blown out. And so there's no way that I can recover the highlights in the sky there. There's just no information. Even if I bring the exposure all the way down, there's just nothing there. So I knew in camera, I needed to take another exposure that kept the sky from being blown out. But now I've blocked up my shadows, clipped my shadows so badly that if I tried to recover them, I'd probably have a lot of noise and low image quality there. So what I want to do is combine. I want to exposure blend these two together. Well, exposure blending, going back, since when I started doing it, was always really difficult and tricky to do, because part of what you had to do is get your raw adjustments of the two layers perfectly set before you blended them together. You had to kind of know ahead of time, somehow magically know what the two different exposures need to look like so they would blend together well. Well, with smart objects, we don't have to do that anymore. So I'm just going to click both of these and say edit in Photoshop as smart objects. I'm going to open both of the frames as smart objects. And let's get out of sharing Lightroom, back to Photoshop. Okay. Oh, and this guy, I can close this one now. Okay. So now here's my light exposure. It's a smart object. Here's my dark exposure. It's a smart object. And I need to get them stacked together as layers in one image document. And that's something that you can't do from Lightroom. You can open as layers, but when you do that, they're not smart objects. So you have to open them as separate image files, and then different ways to get those layered together. But you have to be careful. You can't just copy and paste, because copying and pasting a smart object breaks the smart object. It loses its smart object capabilities. So the way that I do it, I will mention in the TK8 module here, he has an action called stack, which does this for you automatically just by clicking that. But for the non automated way, I grab the move tool, and then I come out onto one of the layers or one of the exposures, hold down the shift key, and then click and drag up to the tab of the other image, and then bring it down, still holding the shift key, and then release the mouse. And that now stacks this exposure as a smart object on top of the other exposure. It's underneath there. So they're stacked up, and the shift key kept the two frames aligned. So they're in alignment, how I took them. And now that I've moved this dark exposure over, I can get rid of this one. I can just close that and say, no, again, Tony's action does that all for us. Just a nice little time saver. All right, so I've got these stacked together, and what I need to do is create a mask that will blend the two of them together. And again, as we saw in that last one, a real easy way to get a sky mask. You could hand make a sky mask with like a luminosity mask or some other way of making a sky mask that you might be able to be more precise. But the new Select Sky in Photoshop does a really good job. And a lot of times it's all you need. So I'm just gonna, let's see, the question is, which layer do I want to do it from? I think I'll go from this layer and see what Photoshop selects. So I'm gonna say select sky. And I think it should, because I'm on that layer, make the, it made the selection from that layer. If I was on this layer, it would make a different selection. But now I'm going to come back up to this top layer and now just add a mask that will be the mask of the sky. So there's my sky mask. So that's what it looks like. That's what Photoshop made for us. Like I said, I might be able to make a luminosity mask that is a blending mask that might do a better job, but that's quick and easy. And now I'm going to turn on that layer. And so that's the blend of the two layers that we get with that mask. Clearly doesn't look good yet. And here's where the raw smart objects come in. This is the power and the benefit here is I can now, after I've already layered them and created that blending mask, adjust the raw adjustments so that the transition zone, like the sky looks fine, the foreground looks fine. The problem that doesn't look natural is the transition zone. So I'm going to use the raw capabilities to get that transition zone to blend more naturally. And the way that you do that is by opening up the first smart object. I'll start with the top one. It doesn't matter which order you go in. But in Camera Raw here, I'm going to use, and see, I didn't make any adjustments yet to this. Oh, and you know what? This is a good point. This might come up as a question, but I'm going to answer it right now just because might help not need to have that question answered. Is the adjustments that you make from Photoshop to your raw adjustments are completely disconnected from the raw adjustments you made back in Lightroom. So here I hadn't made any adjustments in Lightroom, so I don't have any adjustments at this point. But if I did, if I change those, that's changing them in that one smart object layer, but it's not changing them back in Lightroom. And so if I change these adjustments here to this smart object layer in Photoshop, these changes will not show up back in Lightroom. Once you get into Photoshop, every smart object is a different iteration of the raw information, or how the raw information is being shown. All right, so here I want to adjust for my sky, but what I want to do is I want my sky to look as perfect as I can get it, but I want the transition zone and the bottom part of this image to look closer to what the final image should be. So I can probably bring up the overall exposure some. I can definitely bring the shadows up quite a bit. Now, this is where, you know, I can recover these shadows, but because I'm coming from such a dark exposure, a lot of these shadows probably have a lot of noise and not great quality, but I don't care because I'm not going to be using the pixels from this in the final image. They're going to come from the other layer, and I'm only going to be mixing pixels right in that transition zone where the mask is going to make the transition. But the goal is to get it to look close. Let's see, I'm going to recover those highlights in the sky. So that's where that sun looks like that. Bring up the exposure. Let's see, I can also work with my white balance. So I may want to warm up that sky a little bit, and I may want to add in a little vibrance to my sky and just get that looking what I think the final sky should look like. And I don't have to get it perfect because it's a smart object. I can come back and fiddle with these more at any point. So I'll just say, okay. And that helped the blend a little bit, but the real magic is going to come now when I double click on the background layer and open that up in Camera Raw and say, okay, this one, I want to get the foreground looking how I think it should look, but I am going to try to get the sky to better match the final image so that that blend happens well. So again, probably need to bring down highlights quite a bit. Now, if I bring down the highlights, you can see there's no way I'm getting some of that back, but this will at least help things match a little better in this transition zone. Probably bring the overall exposure down. I may bring the temperature up also, bring the shadows up. I'm looking, how do I want my final foreground to look? Maybe bring the contrast in there a little bit, maybe even some of the whites a little bit. Want some of these highlights in the larch trees to really come out. Another thing I know is that, you know, I could try to add some vibrance and saturation to these colors. I could go into the color mixer and work with those colors, but I think if I come to the calibration tab, and this is like a little weird trick, but the blue primary saturation in the calibration tab can do some pretty cool things to the color. So you can see what that's doing. And that's feeling more how that sunlight backlighting those larch trees felt. That would probably be too much color for my sky, the blues in my sky. So I don't want to do that there, but I am going to do that in the foreground. And let's see, what else do I want to do for this foreground here? Anything else? Well, I don't have to worry about getting it perfect now because like I said, I can come back and work with it, adjust it more in the future. Let's say, okay, and let's see how that updates. And there we go. So with that blending mask and then being able to adjust the raw information in both of those layers as I go and seeing how they interact, we've now got this exposure blend of those two difficult exposures that look pretty amazing. So that's the best I would have been able to do with that image with a single exposure. But because I took two exposures and was able to blend them, I can get this much better looking final image. So another advantage of using smart objects, raw smart objects, and some of the other things which we're kind of getting close to the end of the time to go to Q&A here, but I'll just mention, and if somebody wants to see an example and we have time, I can show, you can do raw noise removal. So removing noise in the raw file is the most effective place to do noise removal. But if you're familiar with noise removal, the luminance noise removal in Lightroom, what we get is that while it does remove the noise, it does that by kind of softening or blurring or smoothing the noise, and that smooths out everything. Now, if you want to remove noise from the sky, smoothing out the sky probably is okay, but you don't want to smooth out the details in all the needles of your trees. Well, with 2 raw smart object layers, you could do noise removal in one of the layers and not do noise removal in the other layer, and then use a mask to combine where the noise removal is happening and where it's not happening. And so ideas like that. You can do blends of different white balance settings. So a really powerful way to do split toning is with the actual white balance of the image, and have one raw smart object set to one white balance, another one set to another white balance, and then you can use a mask to send that to the highlights or the shadows so that you can split tone the image with actual raw adjustments. The options for creative stuff that you can do with smart objects, really, it just opens up all kinds of doors. It's pretty amazing stuff. And like I said, my smart object course that I mentioned earlier is 6 hours long of just complete content where you don't have to listen to me kind of stumble around and mix up my words. I've edited all those parts out. So if you want to learn more about this, that's the place to go. All right. So I think at this point, I'm going to say, let's call that good with my presentation, and let's hand over to Trevor for some questions if there are any.
Well, thank you, Sean. There certainly are. Yep, your screen sharing's off. That's great. So now is the time for you to ask any further questions. Well, we've already got 7, but if there's any more, please do use the Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen, or as I've said before, at the top of it's a tablet. As I also said, if you want to comment on today's event or send your thanks, could you please save that for the survey, which we'll be sending out in a couple of days' time. So for today, just as I said before, questions only, please. So we'll start with the first one, question from Tian. Sean, would you recommend converting all images to smart objects as a matter of course? Are there any disadvantages by doing this?
That's a great question, and that's one that comes up all the time. And so this is kind of the chess game, I think, of just image developing in general. I always kind of, my mindset is that I want to do what's easiest and simplest first, and then move to more challenging or time or memory intensive things if I need to. So like I said, there are some downsides to smart objects. I already talked about that. They increase file size, they open and they save slower, and various things like that. And there are other things you can't do with smart objects. So for example, you can't clone or heal directly on a smart object. You also can't do, I'm trying to think here. I always get confused, like what can you do? Those are the main things. Anything that's going to move pixels around, patching, stuff like that, you can't do with smart objects. Oh, I just remembered. The other ones is if you're going to do anything like auto aligning in Photoshop, for example, for focus stacking, you can't auto align or focus stack smart objects in Photoshop. So if I know that I need to do any of that kind of stuff, then I don't open a smart object, because I'm going to have to flatten the smart objects anyways. So it makes no sense to open as a smart object probably. And if I know ahead of time that I'm confident I don't need the smart object, then I might not open as a smart object, just to save space and kind of speed up my workflow. Other than those things I just said, they're probably, opening as a smart object every time only has advantages. And even if you end up not using any of the smart object features, just knowing that they're there and you have them available is very handy.
Okay, thanks for that. Question from Dennis. How large are the files after you save your smart object?
That's a great question. Also, I expect only great questions, of course, from this group. But in my smart object course, actually, there's a chapter where I do that. I make different smart objects with and non-smart objects, and have different numbers of layers and masks, and then save them and look at the final file sizes. And I guess the short answer is it's always different. you get different file sizes, and it's dependent on how much information is being stored in the smart object and how many smart objects you have, how many layers are, how many masks there are, all that, how many filters there are. So there's no one answer. It isn't always a set amount. The less information you're storing in the smart objects, the less the file sizes get big. But in general, what I find is if I had a whole bunch of layers and masks and no smart objects, and then I were to flatten all those layers and masks into a smart object, I think, and I'd have to go back and watch that chapter again, I think it might be as much as almost double the file size. So if you had a 500 megabyte Photoshop file, after doing a smart object to all the layers, you might end up with nearly a gigabyte file, something in that range. Again, for me, I tend to not worry about file size too much. I try to have a fast computer. I try to have lots of hard drive storage space so that I'm not having to choose between the things I want to do with my images and how I want to work on my images and saving some file space. Yeah, that I never want to be stuck with that choice.
Okay, thanks for that. Question from Patricia. I see that you're using ProPhoto RGB. Do you recommend this as a general choice?
For my workflow, yes, I do. I'm not sure that there's a one size fits all answer for this one either. But here's my philosophy in image editing, and I've picked this philosophy up from some of my photography mentors, like John Paul Caponigro, Mac Holbert, and people who know a lot more about this stuff than I do, but learn from them that your camera, the digital cameras these days, if you're collecting raw data, if you're taking raw files, the information that's contained in a raw file there's a massive amount of information. And for me, I want to retain as much of that information that my camera collected as far into my workflow as possible. So ProPhoto RGB is the biggest color space that we can work with out of Lightroom, out of a raw file. And 16 bits per channel is the most bit depth. So I keep everything in ProPhoto color space and 16-bit depth, working on it. Eventually, I may have outputs. Like I may want to print the image with a lab that only accepts Adobe RGB color space. So I'll convert to Adobe RGB with that print copy at that time. Or if I'm going to put that image up on my website, the internet all functions on sRGB, which is the smallest color space. So I'll convert to sRGB at that time, but I don't want to start with sRGB because I would immediately be throwing out all kinds of colors that raw file contains that now are lost to me. Now, if you know that your images will only ever be viewed on a sRGB screen or on the internet, then it might make sense to have your whole workflow be sRGB, because then you know the things you're seeing as you're editing are going to be the things how the image is going to look in its final output. For me, I'm going to be creating prints. Sometimes I can print from the ProPhoto color space with some labs and on my office printer. Other times I need Adobe RGB for other labs. A lot of times I need sRGB for the internet. And so if I start in ProPhoto, I can always downsample my color space. But if you start with a small color space, you can't upsample, you can't go backwards.
That's fair enough. Thank you very much. Follow-up question from Dennis. Do you save the XMP files with the finished image?
So I do have Lightroom set up to save XMP sidecar files. And those sidecar files basically just store all of your raw adjustment settings in a little file that goes with the raw file. So if I were to send that raw file to you, you could see my Lightroom adjustment settings if I wanted you to be able to do that. Whereas if you don't save the XMP file in Lightroom or Camera Raw, then those settings are only stored in the catalog, the Lightroom catalog. And so you'd have to be in my Lightroom catalog to see my adjustments. So having the XMP sidecar file makes the file a little bigger. You've got this extra file that's got to travel around with the raw file. But for me, I want to be able to move my raw files to my other computers or send them to a publisher or whatever. And I want my adjustments to go with it. And so I do save with the XMP sidecar files. Now, the question of the raw smart objects in Photoshop, each one of those layers, we would assume has its own separate sidecar file because it's a different set of raw parameters. The weird thing is, and I don't know what Adobe or what Photoshop is doing kind of behind the curtain, when you open up and you see that raw data there, it's obviously, it's all there, but where is that on the computer? There isn't a sidecar file or sidecar files that go with those image files that have been opened and saved. Because when you save that file from Photoshop, it's still a TIFF file or a PSD file, and there's no sidecar file with it. So the sidecar file must be buried somewhere in there, but I actually don't know where that is, but you don't think about it. It just all happens.
Okay, that's interesting. Thank you.
Yeah.
Question from Colin. Briefly, can you explain TK8?
Brief explanation of TK8. Yes, I can. Let me share my Photoshop screen again. Okay, so TK8 is a plugin for Photoshop. And if you've never heard of plugins for Photoshop, one of the other things that I think about Photoshop that's really powerful, that as far as I'm aware, no other image editing application has, is that Adobe allows third-party developers to create plugins for Photoshop. And so those plugins are kind of like apps for your smartphone. When you get your smartphone, it's amazing. It does a lot of great stuff out of the box, but you can go to the App Store and download additional apps onto your phone that make your phone even better. Plugins for Photoshop are that for Photoshop. They make Photoshop even better. And so one of the third-party apps that you can get, there's lots of them out there, is called the TK8 panel. It's TK8 because that's the most recent version of it. It's made by my friend Tony Kuiper. So I am connected with Tony, I will say, that, he and I are kind of business partners. He creates the panel. He's the wizard with how to create it. I'm just the kind of the instructor. I know how to use it, but I don't know how to make it. Anyway, its current iteration, the 8th version, has 2 modules. This module is called the combo module. And this module is like a control or command center for Photoshop. It does all kinds of things that photographers need to do in Photoshop anyway. It just makes it more efficient and faster. So if you notice in Photoshop, one of the things that is daunting about Photoshop for people is that so many of the things that you want to do are buried in menus and submenus. And even if you're good at Photoshop, it's hard to sometimes remember, where is that? How do I get to that thing? I know what thing it is. I just can't remember where it is. So you've spent a lot of time hunting around or trying to memorize keyboard shortcuts. And that can take up a lot of time, and it can really kind of, I know for me, it kind of messes up or, puts a wrench in my flow. You kind of get a flow going, and then when you spend 5 minutes searching for something, your flow is lost. So all of these things here, most of these things can be found in the menus of Photoshop, but they're right out here on your desktop, like a toolbar, color-coded with little icons. And in fact, even if you're not sure what the icons mean, you can hold down the Alt or the Option key, and then you get little pop-ups that tell you what each button is for. But eventually I just, memorize or learn what these icons are, so I can just quickly go to anything that I normally use in Photoshop right here. It's always out here, visual, color-coded on my desktop. And the other thing is that this module gives you all kinds of actions. So things that we do in Photoshop as photographers that are multi-stepped, and we know how to do them. Some of us know how to do them, but every time you want to do it, wow, this is going to be 10 steps that I have to do to apply this particular thing. Well, here in the TK menu, a lot of these things that take a lot of those steps, you can just run it with a single click of one of these, and it'll run all the steps for you, and you just had to click once. So that's a big time saver. The other thing is, if you've made your own actions in Photoshop, you can add your own actions. So you can run them from right here in the panel. You don't have to go to Photoshop's action panel to get to them. It has a web sharpener, so it sizes images and sharpens them so they look the best on the web, and a bunch of other things. So that's this one module, doing things that you do in Photoshop anyway, just makes it easier and faster. This module is called the multi-mask module, and this module is all about making masks. And these are all different sources for making different kinds of masks. So you can make luminosity masks, you can make zone masks, you can make color range masks. So based on a color like that orange color, if I just want to select the oranges, you can make saturation masks, edge masks. You can do color grading, like in Lightroom, now has this color grading feature in Lightroom, but there is no specific color grading feature in Photoshop. The TK8 module or the plugin has color grading for us, and a bunch of other cool things that you can do with that. So that's the other module. One, like this, I say is normal Photoshop stuff. This is specific to masking. That wasn't short, but hopefully short enough.
Okay, that's great. Thanks so much. And also, I think isn't it on Tony's website, there is a sort of video that tells you all about the panel.
Yes. Yes. If you go Tony's website or my website, yeah, we have some video samples there that, yeah, give you a little more insight into what it does and what it's for.
Okay, thanks for that. Okay, question from Lorna. If raw changes in Photoshop when you blend two copies of the image aren't reflected in, sorry, I'll start that again. If the raw changes you make in Photoshop when you blend two copies of the image aren't reflected in Lightroom, what does that mean for using Lightroom as your catalog of all your images? How do you keep the final version in your Lightroom catalog?
Very good. So when you open up, and whether you've got two different exposures, from two different frames that you took separately in the camera, or it's from a single exposure that you just made duplicates of the smart object, this Photoshop document, so this guy right here, when I save this, so it's got these raw smart objects in it that now have their own settings. But when I save this, I'll go to File, Save, and it's going to save as a TIFF file. Okay, even though it's got raw smart objects in it, the file that's going to save is a TIFF file. And that's just like any other time. If you're in Lightroom, you open, you work on it in Photoshop, you save the TIFF file. The TIFF file shows back up in your Lightroom catalog next to the raw file. So the raw file's there and the TIFF file's there. Same thing with this. I save this as a TIFF file and it's there. The original raw file or files are still there. They're in Lightroom, they're not affected. This new TIFF file is there now also. That's the one that's got the raw smart objects in it. So they're completely separate.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much. Out of interest, does it also, can you also save them as a Photoshop file to go back into Lightroom?
You can. So the two main file types that support layers and masks and all that stuff are TIFF files and PSD files, or Photoshop document files. There is a third one called a PSB file, which stands for Photoshop Big. So PSD files and TIFF files have a size limit. PSD files, the size limit is 2 gigabytes. TIFF files, the size limit is 4 gigabytes. I use TIFF files because other than that, they're really basically the same thing. There's no quality differences. There's minor size differences between PSD and TIFF. But anyway, TIFF files can be up to 4 gigabytes. But if you never have file sizes that big, if you're always under the 2 gigabyte limit with your image files, PSD works just as well. If you go over the 2 or the 4, then that's when PSB comes in. You're going to save that file as a Photoshop Big document. And those can be basically, you can have a file that's bigger than any hard drive. So yeah, no size limit to PSB files.
Does Lightroom work with PSB files? The older versions didn't, did it?
It does now. And that was one of the disadvantages of having image files that got bigger than that. And I even had a video years ago that kind of showed a workaround of how you could get your PSB files into Lightroom by using smart objects was the workaround. But I don't know, maybe a year or so ago, Adobe finally added, maybe 2 years now, added PSB support in Lightroom. So your PSB files show up in Lightroom just fine.
Great, thanks for that. Question from Catherine. How do you save back to Lightroom and be able to reopen in Photoshop to make further adjustments later?
So the way Lightroom and Photoshop work together is, as long as you start in Lightroom, when you go to Photoshop, then when you save in Photoshop, just do a normal save, not a save as, you just do a normal save, then Lightroom knows to automatically add that new file that you made into your Lightroom catalog. So open from Lightroom, then save in Photoshop, automatically updates you back in your catalog. If you open the image from outside of Lightroom, or if you do a save as and change something about the file, so you change its file name, or you change the location, the folder where it's going to be saved, then Lightroom doesn't know that you did that, and it won't automatically come back into Lightroom for you. That's not the end of the world. If you end up doing something in Photoshop that doesn't, you didn't come out of Lightroom and go straight back to Lightroom, so it doesn't end up in Lightroom. Let me show you really quick. So let me share here, because this happens to me all the time too. It just inevitably at some point you'll end up doing something in, let's see, get me back to here. Here we go. Okay, you'll end up doing something in Photoshop that you don't find your image back here in Lightroom. But if you know where it should be or where it might have gone, you can go to that folder in your folders list and right click on any folder and say synchronize folder. And Lightroom will go look in that folder and find any files that aren't in the catalog and say, aha, I found some missing files. Do you want to add them to the catalog? And if you don't know where it got saved, so what folder to look in, you can come up here to all photographs and let's see, nope, sorry, not all photographs. What you need to do is go to, in your folders, come up to your main folder. I thought you could do it from here. Import, no, apparently you can't. You've got to do it from a folder. But like, for example, I have this folder here called my main photo collection, which has 90,000 images in it. I can synchronize my entire 90,000 image collection. It'll find all the missing photos wherever they are, whatever folder they're in. So you can, if you end up not saving something back to your Lightroom catalog, synchronize it and you'll find it.
Okay, great. Thanks for that. Question from Jacqueline. When you have reached the point of being happy with the image, can you just flatten the image with smart objects?
You can, yes. So if you feel like I am done with this image forever, I'm never going to come back and adjust a single thing in this image ever again, you can do a normal flatten in Photoshop, and that'll flatten everything. It'll flatten the layers, it'll flatten the masks, it'll flatten the smart objects. So everything's gone. All you now have is just a single pixel layer, and that's it. So you can do that. You can flatten everything and get rid of all the smart objects. That's not something that I ever do, because I have yet to find an image that I revisit, let's say, years later and don't immediately think, wow, I need to make some fine adjustments to this, and I want all of those layers and smart objects still there. So I don't ever flatten anything. I mean, if it's an output copy that I'm going to make for the web, I make a copy and I flatten that, because that's not going to get adjusted anymore. But my master file, I want all those layers there, because like I said, I don't want to have to start over from the beginning and re-edit the image entirely, but I almost always want to do little fine tweaks years later.
Okay, thanks for that. Question from Sheila. So she says, so do you have to rasterize?
Do you have to rasterize to flatten?
I don't know. She just says, do you have to rasterize? So that's all the question is.
Let's talk about what rasterize is first, and that'll probably answer the question. So I'm back here in Photoshop, and we have smart objects. And when we right click on a non-smart object, we get or a smart object, we get this option to convert to smart object. But if we have a smart object that we want to no longer be a smart object, that's this guy right here, rasterize layer. So if I don't want to if you flatten the whole image, all the smart objects automatically get rasterized as part of the flattening. But if you don't want to flatten everything, you just want to rasterize, or you want to make one smart object no longer a smart object, you go to that layer. So I'm on this layer, and then I just say rasterize the layer, and now it's no longer a smart object. And if I double click on that, I don't get back to the raw information anymore. So does that answer the question?
Hopefully, although we still have the Q&A open. So if not, if Sheila can come back with an update, that'd be great.
Okay.
Moving on quickly. Question from Alan: how do you store your backup files?
My backup files, in terms of backing, I'm assuming in terms of backing up my images. So my system, yeah, because obviously backing up in the age of digital photography is a really important thing to do, because we're always ever just one hard drive crash away from losing, all of our life's work. So redundancy is key. And I try to have my images in 3 locations minimum at all times. So all my master files, this is my master file. So I don't keep redundancy necessarily of something I'm just going to post on Instagram. It's a little tiny, 1080 pixel copy. Those I'm not so worried about. But what I do is I have a big working hard drive in my computer. It's, I don't know, 16 terabytes, I think, just so I can have every single image in my catalog and every, that I've taken on one hard drive in my computer. So that's one place where they are. That hard drive is continuously backing up to the cloud with a service I use called Backblaze. There's lots of different cloud services. For me, Backblaze, the price is great. The amount of storage that you get is unlimited. I'm not affiliated with them in any way. So I'm not, this is no kickback for this. This is what I use and why I like them. And it's continually backing up. So anytime I add a new image or download new images or save a change to an image, it's looking for those changes, and it's continually keeping my backup in the cloud up to date with whatever the current state of my data drive is. So that's place number 2. Place number 3 where I keep backups is on a big RAID. It's a Drobo. It's kind of RAID for dummies. It's a thing you can buy, Drobo. There's other types of things, which it's expandable. So as my collection grows, I can keep expanding how much storage space this thing has in. And about once a month or so, I would say I do a backup of my whole, again, that whole data drive backs up to my Drobo. And that's the 3rd place. So I've got my working location on my computer. That's where I'm doing the work on my images from. I've got an on-site backup, which is the Drobo, and it's backed up periodically. So, potentially depending, I might lose up to a month's worth of work there if I haven't backed up recently, but I can quickly get back, most of my work within, almost immediately. I can get it back if my main hard drive goes down. And then the cloud storage is there to pick up anything that I might have missed on the Drobo, or if my whole office burns down and my computer and my Drobo are gone, everything's still also up in the cloud. So that's my system. I don't know if that's the best system, but that's what works for me.
Okay, thank you for that. A quick follow-up from Sheila. She's saying, do you need to rasterize? She said, that is in order to proceed with, say, cloning on a layer.
Yes. So if you want to do something to the smart object that smart objects can't do, so for example, cloning, yes, you need to either rasterize the layer. So now that layer is a pixel layer, and now you can actually change the pixels. You can put other pixels in their place. That's why you can't clone on a smart object. So you could rasterize the layer, or you could copy the layer and then rasterize the copy so that you still have the smart object back there. That gives you a little bit of backup, because if you realize that you needed to go back and do something with the smart object, it's still there. It's just on a different layer. At some point, you might do enough other things, enough cloning, hours worth of cloning that you've done, that the idea that you're going to delete the cloning layer that you made and go back adjust the raw, the smart object layer, and then redo all your cloning on a new rasterized layer. At some point, you're probably not going to do that. So, but the idea is you've got a little safety net that way. But if you can, what I do is I do what I call smart cloning. There are rudimentary cloning and patching and healing tools in Lightroom. So if I find something that Lightroom can do, and it's on a smart object, especially a raw smart object, I just go in and do my cloning using using Lightroom's cloning and healing tools. Like if it's a dust spot or something that's pretty easily removable, and if it removes it in Camera Raw or Lightroom, that's removing it from the raw data. And so that then updates to my all my layers in Photoshop with no need to rasterize. So if I can do that, I'll do that first. And I only go to rasterizing or compressing to a new layer if I really have to.
Okay, we've still got another 9 questions to go. Are you happy to carry on?
I'm happy as long as people want to sit and listen.
Okay. Well, I've got a follow-up question from Catherine. She asked about saving files. She says, thanks for your answer, but how do you then take your TIFF image back to Photoshop from Lightroom if you decide you want to make some further adjustments? So I guess you're asking, do you have all the original adjustment layers available?
Exactly. So as long as you save, so let me do a quick share here of Lightroom, so we can get an example of this. Okay, so I'm going to go to, this is a TIFF file that I've edited. I'm going to go to that TIFF files look. This is in a collection I made, so it's not by the raw file right now, but I'm going to say, I just right click on that and say, go to the folder where that image is in my library. So here it is. Here's my TIFF file, and here's the raw file that it came from. So those show up that way. I went to Photoshop, did a bunch of stuff to this, saved it as a TIFF file with layers. So that's one of the things you want to make sure that you save it with the layers. Sometimes there's a prompt when you're saving a TIFF file. It's like, do you want to keep the layers or not? The answer is yes, if you get asked that. It shows up here in Lightroom with, you don't see the layers. If I go to the develop module, I don't see the layers. And notice I've got my adjustments. I could adjust this TIFF file here in Lightroom, but I usually don't do that here in Lightroom because we then come into a problem. I can get back to Photoshop. So this is the TIFF file. Here's the raw file. That's what it looked like out of the camera. This is after I did my Photoshop adjustments. So I can right click on the TIFF file and say edit in Photoshop. And it's going to ask me, how do I want to open that in Photoshop? If I edit the original, that's my original TIFF file with all the layers in it. So I can open that. And if I say, go ahead, let's do that. So here it is, opened up in Photoshop. Oh, you guys can't see that. Let me go over to Photoshop here. Sorry. Photoshop. So sharing Photoshop again. So here it is in Photoshop, and there are all those layers. So I opened this out of Lightroom. And when it opens up in Photoshop, because it was saved with the layers are all there. And I can make adjustments to those layers or add new layers or do anything I want. And then when I do a save again, Control or Command S, save it and close it. Then back in Lightroom, let's go back to Lightroom again. I didn't do any adjustments to it, but had I done adjustments and saved those, then back here in Lightroom, those adjustments would show up. Now, here's the problem. If I have this TIFF file that I originally adjusted in Lightroom, went to Photoshop, did a bunch of stuff in Photoshop. Now I'm back here in Lightroom. If I make, let's say I realize in Lightroom, I want to open the, I want to adjust this here in Lightroom. I'm making new adjustments in Lightroom to the TIFF file, not to the original raw data. This is now happening to the TIFF file. And now if I say I want to edit back in Photoshop again, if I edit the original, that's the original with the Photoshop layers, but not with the Lightroom adjustments I just made. I can edit a copy with Lightroom adjustments. So it does show these new Lightroom adjustments, but that copy does not have all the layers. It's a copy that's flattened with the Lightroom adjustments. So once you've made the TIFF file, I generally don't make further Lightroom adjustments to the TIFF file, because then you have this choice. Do you want to open the original with the Photoshop layers, or do you want to open a copy with the Lightroom adjustments, but you can't get both? So I hope that's the answer to the question.
Sounds good. And I think also it answers a question that Steve had as well, which I think Deborah said that you just covered.
Okay, good.
Very quick question from Sheila again is, how do you hide the XMP files so you don't clutter?
You mean like in your image folders? How do you hide the XMP files? You know, I don't know on a Mac, I'm a PC guy. I don't know on a Mac. I think on a PC, there is a way to go in and say, you know, don't show certain file types. You can tell it not to, you can tell Windows not to do that. And I'm sure in a Mac, you can tell the operating system, don't show XMP files. So if you want to do that, for me, I don't care that the XMP files show, because honestly, because I use Lightroom, I never go into my image folders and I never see the XMP files. Again, like I said, once you're using Lightroom as a catalog, it's best to do all of everything that you would do with your images from Lightroom. That way Lightroom is aware that you did it. So if I'm moving images around, if I'm renaming images, if I'm putting images in different folders, I do that from the library module in Lightroom. So Lightroom keeps up to date with all of those things. And in that way, I also never have to go into my image folders and see all those XMP files.
Okay, a question from Paul. How does masking in TK8 compare with the new masking functionality in Lightroom and Photoshop?
Right, and that gets back to kind of what I was saying at the beginning. Yeah, these new masks in Lightroom are really amazing. In fact, both Tony and I were on the kind of the beta development thread as the Adobe team was developing that. We had no part in developing it, but we could kind of watch them as they were developing that over the last year. And we could kind of see, oh, this is going to be amazing. And honestly, I know one of the people on the team, he actually lives not too far from me here in Southern Oregon. And I've met him a couple of times, really amazing guy. And I don't know, I haven't asked him, but a lot of the things that are in the new masking capabilities are very similar to the things that the TK panel can do. I don't know where they were drawing their inspiration from, but there's definitely a lot of crossover there. I will say what I said, I'll say again, what I said at the beginning is the new stuff in Lightroom is amazing. At this point though, there's still more options, more flexibility, more control in Photoshop. Lightroom's a huge upgrade. There's so much you can do in Lightroom now with these masks that you couldn't do before. But there still are places, as I've been kind of experimenting with it, where I can get a pretty good mask in Lightroom, where I know I could get the perfect mask in Photoshop, just because Photoshop just has more options, more ways to get at the problem. Whereas Lightroom, while it has a lot more, still is somewhat limited. That said, the other thing I said earlier is that I always start with the easiest thing first. So if I can quickly make a mask in Lightroom that's going to do everything I need, and the end result, the end result's going to be identical to what I could do in Photoshop, then I'll do it in Lightroom. Quick, be done with it. But if I'm in Lightroom and I'm getting to a place where, I just am not happy with what I'm able to do here, now I know, okay, I can go over to Photoshop, use masking capabilities in Photoshop, and probably do a better job.
Okay, which probably actually follows on to the question from Richard, which I think you probably covered quite well, but I'll go through it anyway. What is the point of doing editing of an image in Lightroom now that it is virtually identical to ACR with the latest edition?
And the answer to that is there is no point. And like I said, a lot of times for me, it's easy. You're in Lightroom and you've got your whole bunch of images that you're working on, and just to kind of move from one image to the next and do quick adjustments. Because, when we see our raw files, the raw files aren't the final image. And so to quickly visualize, like, what's the potential of this image versus that one, there's a lot of advantages in Lightroom to be able to just go from one image to the next. You can even do side-by-side comparisons in Lightroom. And there's a lot of advantages in Lightroom for that kind of quick work. So a lot of times I'll still do that. But when it comes down to just like, this is the image, I'm going to go work on it in Photoshop because there's a lot of the Photoshop stuff that I want to do. Yeah, I'll just won't even work on it all in Lightroom. I'll just open it in Photoshop as a smart object and do all the work there. Let's see. Oh, but there are other times where I'll be in Lightroom working on an image and realize, you know what, I think I don't need Photoshop at all. I can do everything I need to do with this image from Lightroom. So if that's the case, that's another, I guess, argument for using Lightroom is that sometimes I'll finish the image in Lightroom and never go to Photoshop at all.
So it kind of depends on the image, really.
It really does. Yeah. Image to image, or, what your workflow is. I'm working on this one image today versus I'm going to try to kind of churn through 200 images and I just want to do some quick edits and then, go from there.
Okay, quick question from Patricia. She says the latest edition of RAW, I presume she means Camera Raw, seems to have lost the graduated filter. Is she right?
The next, no, it's in there. It's in there. It's just they've changed it up a little bit, as always happens. So let's go to Lightroom. And again, this is the same in Camera Raw. So in the Lightroom Develop module, so up here is where you used to have all of those, and you still do, the various tools, the Lightroom tools, they just look different now. And you used to have the radial filter, the gradient filter, and the brush tool. And those have all been added into this one mask icon right here now. So if you just click that icon, then that opens up the mask list here. And right here is the linear gradient. So it's still there. It's just under this masking icon with, now you can do select subject, select sky. There's still the brush tool. That's the original Lightroom brush tool, linear gradient, radial gradient. You can also do color range mask and luminance mask. And you can do depth range mask if you're working on an image that has depth information in it, which I am waiting for our SLR cameras to somehow get depth information. The only place I know of right now is if you're using a smartphone that has multiple lenses, these images can have depth information because it can take the image with different focal lengths all in one image. And then you can do what's called depth masking, which is pretty cool. But on single images from SLRs at this point, not possible, but it's a cool idea. I hope we figure that out.
Okay, that's great. Thanks very much. So let's got 3 more questions to go. Quick one from Batian is, I have TK7. How do I upgrade to TK8?
Okay, so if you had TK7, we did a big upgrade process back when it came out, when TK8 came out in September, and we sent out emails to all of the TK7 and TK6 and TK5 customers from the past to let them know new version. Here's update information. So a lot of those emails, sometimes people have used an email that they no longer use. So they didn't get the email for that reason, or those emails sometimes get sent to spam, or they just bounce entirely. A firewall or something blocks them. So we apologize that sometimes people don't get those notices. And at this point, the update window has closed. We did it for a month. So those codes, even if you go back and find your email at this point, those codes are deactivated. So what you need to do is find out, who did you get the TK7 panel from? It's probably either me or Tony, although there are some people in other countries that do sell it. I know in Spain and Germany and a couple other places, but probably me or Tony for most people, English speakers anyways. Send an email to the person you purchased TK7 from. We can look you up in our system, and then we can help you get information for getting the upgrade.
Okay, that's great. Thanks very much. Last 2. One from Anne is, if you convert your raw files to DNG on import, does the XMP data get embedded with the DNG file?
It does. So that's one of the benefits, I guess, kind of DNG files. So the proprietary camera raw files, so from Canon, they're CR something files. That's Canon's proprietary raw file type. Nikon has one, Sony has theirs. All the camera companies want to keep their raw file tech secret and keep it from, the other companies. So that's why Photoshop has to write the sidecar file, because Photoshop doesn't have permission to write that into the raw file itself. But if you convert to the DNG file, take your whatever camera raw file, convert it to a DNG, that's open source. So Adobe can write directly to the DNG file. So in DNG files, all that sidecar information isn't in a sidecar file, it's right in the raw file itself.
Okay, that's great. And the last question from David is, I'd be interested to see how you handle selective noise reduction, please.
Okay. That might take me just a couple of minutes. I'll do a quick
demo. That's why I left it to the end.
Perfect. Okay, so let's do that. Let's do that. So let me go back to Lightroom here for you guys. Let's see. No, actually, I'm going to go to Photoshop. I need to open an image from Lightroom, but you don't need to see me do that. So I'm doing some quick stuff in Lightroom here. Thank you for your patience. Let me find the right image file that I have for that. Let's see where, all right, here we go. Let's see, I think, well, this one works well. Edit in, we'll go with this as a smart object. Okay. So here we are in Photoshop, and this is a night sky image. Milky Way shot. It's not a good photograph. Well, the Milky Way is all right, but you know, the rest of the composition, not anything to shout about. But it was taken with an older model Canon camera, and when we do these night exposures like this, we have to crank up the ISO, and then it's very dark, so there's going to be a lot of shadow recovery. So if I just go into, I opened it as a raw smart object, so I can go into the raw information here, and let's see if I really, you know, bring up the exposure and then zoom in on this, we can see it's just full of noise. Now, I may want to do certain things to this image to bring out the Milky Way, bring out the stars, and bring out some of the foreground information. And for some of it, I may want to use noise reduction, but if I come down here to noise reduction and do a bunch of noise reduction to get rid of that noise, parts of the sky, that noise reduction is fine, but we can definitely see in other parts, things start looking a little plasticky and unreal. So what I want to do is use noise reduction in parts of the image and not noise reduction in other parts of the image. So let me just cancel out of this and say, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to duplicate, actually, no, what I'm going to do first, watch this. So what I'm going to do first is open it up again, and I'm going to make some of my initial adjustments to kind of get the Milky Way looking how I think I want it to look. So I'm going to bring up highlights, and I'll bring up the whites a bit here to bring out that Milky Way. I can bring out some clarity, and let's see, maybe some, let's see, contrast. I don't know where I want to go with that. I don't know. Let's say that's the adjustments I want to make to really kind of enhance that Milky Way. And I'll say, okay. So there's that updated adjustments, raw adjustments. And now I'm going to make a copy of this, not a duplicate, a copy. So smart object via copy. And that, because I copied it, it comes with the same adjustments so far. But now what I can do with this copy that is otherwise identical is I can open that up. And to that copy, I'm going to come down to the detail tab, and I'm going to add a whole bunch of noise reduction to that. So I'm really kind of overdoing it so you can see it in the feed here, but you can see how soft that's become. So I've really reduced the noise. I'm going to go ahead and say, okay. So on top, I've got my noise reduction layer, and underneath I've got my sharp layer. And now I want to apply the noise reduction only to the areas of the image that are kind of smooth, that don't have edges. So there's different ways we could do that. We could say, well, maybe I just want to apply it to the dark areas because it's a lot of the darkest areas that have the noise. That's where I want the noise reduction to go to, but I don't want it to go to the stars, which are lighter. So I could use a darks luminosity mask. That would be one option. I'll show that here in a second, but say another option is in the TK8 module, Tony added a new feature called edge masks. And this allows you to make masks based on the edges in the image. So this mask, as you can see, most of the edges in this image are stars. There are a few edges down here in some of the landscape, but most of them are stars. So this edge mask is this mask would target the noise reduction to the stars, but I want to target the noise reduction to everything but the stars. I want to keep my stars nice and sharp. So I would actually invert this edge mask. And now I have a mask that protects the stars and would apply the noise reduction to all the spots in between the stars. So that's another way we could go, is with an edge mask. But I'm actually going to do this one with the luminosity mask just real quick here and say another way we could approach this. And I think this might be a better way, because this actually takes into account the bright areas, of the Milky Way here. So this is the luminosity mask source that I'm going to in the panel. And now I want to find a mask that protects the stars and the Milky Way and puts the noise reduction to the smooth areas. And that's probably going to be a darks mask. So I come over here to the dark side, the dark side, and say, okay, we're getting in here. And the darker the Milky Way becomes, the more that stuff and all these little pinpoint stars, when they're dark, they're going to be protected. So that's probably a good start. Let's try this. I'm going to modify it a bit though, because I want there to be even more contrast in this mask. So I'm going to modify. This is the modify section. I first selected a mask. Now I'm going to modify it with a levels adjustment. And I'm going to make the bright parts of the mask even brighter, go all the way to white in some areas, and make the dark parts of the mask even darker. Let's see, maybe something in there, really protect those stars. So I'm going to do that. And the other thing I'm going to do is, I know there's a ton of noise down here in the landscape, but I also don't want the landscape to look plasticky. So I actually don't want any of the noise reduction to come down there. So I'm going to grab the black brush and use that to just brush out this area down here. I don't want any noise reduction coming in to the landscape. And I'm doing a pretty sloppy job of this. I could be much more careful with this, but let's just say that's good enough. So there's my mask that's going to apply noise reduction just where I want it. And now I just need to add that mask to that top layer, which I do with this button, which is the apply button. So now there is that mask that I made on that layer. And if we zoom in on this, what we can see is, let's see, I don't know if you guys can see that. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to really enhance both of them. I can see it. It's working really well, but I'm going to go into this bottom layer and try to make the noise really come out. So I'm going to increase the sharpening and bring down all noise reduction. Let's see, really make that noise. And let's go even in one more step. So now you can probably see how much noise there is there. That's the full noise. And now this layer, I'm going to come in and really do even more noise reduction. Let's see, let's bring the noise reduction all the way up. Let's bring color noise reduction. Let's bring the sharpening down to 0. So there's no sharpening. And let's say okay to that. And so now, I don't know if you can see that in this area here. Let me go out to this outer area. You can see there's all the noise. There's the noise reduction. But if I did that noise reduction without the mask, my stars would get blurry too. So my stars are staying sharp while I'm still doing noise reduction. And if I felt like down here, that mask wasn't blocking out enough noise, I can come with the mask in layer mask mode and further adjust that mask in 2-up mode here, so that I can see here's the mask and here's the image. And I'm going to make further modifications to this mask. And I think probably the way to do it is with a curves adjustment, or sorry, not levels, curves. And I'm going to use the targeted adjustment tool. And what this will allow me to do is make the dark parts of the mask that are being protected even darker. Oops, too dark. There, let's see, it's not, yeah, there we go. So make those parts even darker. I'll have to do it on the curve. It's getting a little jumpy. And then in these light parts of the mask where I want the noise reduction to go, I'm going to make them even lighter. And that will now get even more of that noise reduction into the image. Whoops, didn't mean to make another point. Sorry, Photoshop's getting a little jumpy on me here. Been working long enough. So something in there, and I'll say okay. And now I can exit layer mask mode and close one of these guys. And so now you can see that mask is really protecting or getting rid of that noise in those areas. Probably overdid it there, but like I said, allowing you guys to see it better. So the noise reduction, but my Milky Way is staying nice and sharp. So that's the basic idea of doing noise reduction with two different smart object layers using the raw noise reduction.
Great, thank you very much, Sean. Well, that was the last question. So if you have turned the screen sharing off, that's great. So once again, many thanks for that. Really useful, really informative afternoon. And thanks for staying on so late with us. That's been really appreciated. Now, for more information, you can visit Sean's website with the address that's just literally popped up on your screen. And that includes the RPS discount code, which, as Sean did tell you, actually is now 25% for Black Friday. So get in quick, because they do expire, as Sean has also mentioned. So basically, those details will also be in the follow-up email, which will be coming out in a couple of days, along with the link to the recording. So RPS Digital Imaging is very glad that you joined us for this event. Thanks for coming along. This is Digital Imaging's 26th online event, and we now have many more in the pipeline. If you're not already a member, you will find that even though the fee for non-members is very low, if you are an RPS member, you will probably save money by joining the Digital Imaging Group as a digital-only member. So that concludes today. Our next online event will be a talk by Jonathan Vaines called Life in the Blender. It's a creative twist it'll be on Saturday, December the 4th, same time, same place. So thank you once again, Sean. And in the meantime, everybody else, please stay safe. See you again soon. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. It's been a lot of fun. I enjoyed being here.
Thank you.